We are finally going to finish up on Chapter 8 today. We left off on kind of a down note last lecture because what we demonstrated was that health insurance markets are incredibly susceptible to adverse selection death spirals. So what I'd like to do today is to consider how we might save the market from a death spiral. And there are going to be three mechanisms that we're going to put to the test and try to figure out whether any one of these would save the market. First off, let's consider what would happen if we just changed our baseline model so that the side of the market without complete information really likes the thing being exchanged. It's a little bit easier to think about this in the context of the used car market, so let's quickly return to that market. And in the used car market, we had buyers and sellers of used cars, and each had a utility function that was equal to the summation of a coefficient times x plus m. On the seller side, there was an implied coefficient of 1 in front of the x, and on the buyer side, there's a coefficient of 3/2 in front of the x. So what we want to think about is what would happen if we just put a bigger coefficient on buyer's x. Recall the 3/2 was somewhat arbitrary. The only important thing about it was that it was bigger than seller's coefficient of 1. So to see what happens if buyers really like cars, let's just erase the 3/2 and put in a 5/2. Then we can just redo the math and see if anything changes so that the market doesn't break down. First of all, sellers' condition for when to offer their car on the market will not change because we haven't touched seller's utility function. What will still be true is that only the cars that are worth the price or less will be offered for sale. But the question is, will buyers now be willing to purchase one of these cars that's offered for sale, given that they like cars more? To answer this, we can simply calculate buyers' new change in expected utility and see if it's greater than or equal to 0. Well, with the new coefficient, buyers' expected change in utility will be 5/2 times the expected x minus p. When will that be greater than or equal to 0? It will be greater than or equal to 0 when 5/4 p is greater than or equal to p. In other words, it will always be greater than or equal to 0, which means it will always be in buyers' best interest to purchase one of the cars that's available when they like cars this much, and that's independent of the market price. So in plain language, this simply means that the market will not collapse under these particular conditions. And the way we can tell it doesn't collapse is because cars are actually being exchanged. So let's translate this back to the health insurance market. In the health insurance market, having the side of the market that lacks information really liking the product would be equivalent to insurance companies really liking to insure people, even if they're losing money. So since that's an unlikely bet for saving the market, let's consider something else. Second consideration is what would happen if the government intervened by regulating insurance premiums? In other words, would a premium ceiling keep the insurance market from collapsing? Well, not only would this not work, it would actually expedite the speed at which the market is killed. So to demonstrate this, let's suppose the government sets a premium ceiling at $17,500. So this would be like the government going to insurance companies and telling them, you are not allowed to charge people more than $17,500 for insurance. What would happen? If the insurance market started out where it did initially, where the insurance company was charging premiums of $10,000, then the first thing that would happen is that people whose expected healthcare costs were $10,000 or less would drop from the market. And this would cause the insurance company to suffer a loss because on average they would be paying out $15,000 per customer to cover their medical bills. If the insurance company raised their premium to $15,000 in response to this loss, well, another round of adverse selection would just occur. This time everyone whose expected healthcare costs were $15,000 or less would drop from the market, and the pool of remaining customers would become compositionally even sicker and even more costly. And now, on average, the insurance company would be paying out $17,500 per customer to cover their medical bills. So if the insurance company didn't know any better, they would just raise their premium to $17,500. For the same reasons that we've been talking about, this wouldn't solve any problems. The insurance company would still be losing money. But now the complication would be that the insurance company couldn't respond by increasing the premium further because they've reached the premium ceiling. So what would happen is the market would just collapse right here. Note that if the ceiling wasn't there, there would be a couple more rounds of adverse selection, and the market premium would keep on going up until it reached the point of $20,000, and the market would then die at that point. But now the market just dies sooner. So far we have no good news unless we can somehow make insurance companies really altruistic. There doesn't seem to be any credible mechanism for saving the insurance market. But let's consider one last thing. What would happen if the government intervened in the market by imposing a minimum quality standard? A minimum quality standard would say that people who own products that are below a given quality level would not be allowed to exchange their goods on the market. Okay, to understand this, it's a little bit easier to think about the used car market. In the used car market, a minimum quality standard might look like the government saying to car sellers, if your car has a quality level less than, say, 20, then you're just not allowed to offer it for sale. Because if you did, then whoever purchased it would really get ripped off, and we don't want to let customers suffer to that extent. Well, believe it or not, the introduction of a minimum quality standard may actually allow a small number of transactions to occur. To demonstrate this, let's just say that the government does impose a minimum quality standard of 20 in the used car market. Again, this would mean that all cars below the 20 bar on the quality scale would be removed from the market because they would not be allowed to be offered. Same as before, the cars that were worth more than the market price would voluntarily be removed from the market because the sellers wouldn't be willing to let them go at the market price since they were worth more than that. All right, what this would leave us with is a set of cars available for sale that are in the range of the minimum quality standard of 20 up to the price. This is actually great news for buyers because now if a buyer purchases one of the available cars without knowing its quality level on the outset, worst case scenario, they'll get a car that's worth 20. And this is far better than the previous worst case scenario where they might get a car that was worth 0. So the question is, would they now be willing to purchase a car without knowing its quality beforehand? To answer this, we simply need to look at whether buyers' new change in expected utility is greater than or equal to 0. Under these conditions, used car buyers' expected change in utility would be equal to 3/2 times the expected quality of the car they'd get minus the price. And this would be equal to 3/2 times, and in parentheses, 20 plus the price divided by 2. And then from all of that, you would subtract P. All right, when would that be greater than or equal to 0? It would be greater than or equal to 0 when P is less than or equal to 60. In other words, as long as the market price is 60 or less, we're in business. We have buyers buying, and so the market is working, and it has not resulted in a death spiral. This is great news. So let's just translate this back to the health insurance market and see what we would need to do in that market to mimic these conditions. Well, in the health insurance market, a minimum quality standard would look like the government coming in and saying, people who are thinking about buying insurance, if your expected healthcare costs are greater than this particular level, then you are not allowed to buy insurance, because if you do, you'll be so costly for insurance companies that you'll do major damage to their finances, and we really want to prevent insurance companies from being hurt that much financially. Okay, this is where theory and reality completely collide, because theory says that it would be possible to keep a health insurance market from a death spiral by imposing a minimum quality standard, but that would mean telling really sick people that they were not allowed to buy health insurance. And realistically, it would be next to impossible to get that sort of policy implemented, because frankly, it's kind of a cruel policy. So what is the overall takeaway? The overall takeaway is that it is really, really hard to come up with ways to keep health insurance markets from descending into a death spiral, which is why health economists are important, because this is a complicated market, and so we need people who can understand it and come up with creative ways to fix things. All right, with that, we have come to the end of Chapter 8. As a reminder, the next exam is going to be next class, and it will cover Chapters 7 and 8. There's only 2 chapters to study, which is good because you don't have to study so broadly, but they're both fairly technical chapters, so make sure you're studying deeply. If you have any questions or if anything is confusing, reach out and I'll try to answer questions. After 10 minutes, we will then meet back for the exercise. For the exercise, I'd like you to consider one other possible way that we might save a market from a death spiral, and it's a way that we didn't formally consider during the lecture. The first thing we thought about during the lecture was what would happen if used car buyers really like cars, and we said that in that situation it's actually possible to prevent a death spiral, but it's unrealistic that that situation is ever going to materialize in the world. So what I want you to think about now is what would happen if used car sellers had a distaste for used cars. In other words, they got less utility out of each used car than what it was worth. If that was the case, then the coefficient on sellers X and their utility function would be less than 1. So here's the particular scenario I would like you to consider and then work through the math and answer the questions for. Suppose used car sellers have a utility function that is equal to the summation of 1/4 times X plus M, and used car buyers have a utility function that's equal to 3/2 times X plus M. Question 1, with these utility functions, which used cars would be offered for sale? The hint is that you need to calculate the new change in utility for the sellers, set it greater than or equal to 0, and then go from there. Question 2, given the cars are now offered for sale, what would buyers' expected change in utility be, assuming universal market price P? The hint here is you need to calculate the change in expected utility for buyers. And then the final question is, given the cars are offered for sale and buyers' expected change in utility, would the above scenario where sellers have a distaste for used cars work to prevent a death spiral? So you need to submit 3 answers, and once you have that done, you will be finished for the day.